They always said I was too sensitive. Every family gathering, every business meeting, every decision that mattered. There it was again. Marcus is too emotional. He takes everything personally. Maybe we should handle this without him. For 28 years, I believed them. I thought my feelings were a weakness, that caring too much was somehow wrong. But sensitivity isn't weakness. It's awareness. And when you're aware enough, you see everything, including the lies, the manipulation, and exactly where they hid the money they thought I'd never find. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The Whitmore Family Trust was established in 1987 when my grandfather, Theodore Whitmore, sold his chain of hardware stores across the Midwest for $47 million. He was a practical man who believed in family legacy and keeping wealth in the bloodline. The trust was designed to provide for his children and grandchildren for generations, with careful provisions about how and when the money could be accessed. I grew up hearing stories about Grandpa Ted's wisdom, his business acumen, how he'd built something from nothing and wanted to make sure his family would never struggle. My father, Richard Whitmore, was the eldest son and became the primary trustee when Grandpa Ted passed in 2003. My Uncle David and Aunt Patricia were secondary trustees, and there were 4 grandchildren who would eventually inherit equal shares: myself, my sister Caroline, and my cousins Bradley and Jessica. At least, that's what I was told growing up. The too sensitive comments started early. When I was 12 and cried at my grandfather's funeral, my father pulled me aside afterward. "Son, you need to toughen up. Whitmore men don't fall apart in public." When I was 16 and got upset about my parents missing my debate tournament for a golf weekend, I was told I was being dramatic and making everything about myself. In college, when I questioned why my trust distributions seemed smaller than my cousins, I was informed that I was paranoid and too emotional to understand complex financial matters. The pattern continued into my adult life. I became a social worker, which my family saw as proof of my bleeding heart nature. While Caroline went into corporate law, Bradley became an investment banker, and Jessica married a surgeon. I was the one helping troubled kids navigate the foster care system for $38,000 a year. At family dinners, the conversation would flow around stock portfolios and real estate investments while I sat quietly, picking at my food, feeling like a family failure. "Marcus is just wired differently," my mother would say with that patronizing smile I'd grown to hate. "He feels things more deeply than the rest of us." She'd say it like it was a medical condition, something to be managed rather than valued. The breaking point came last Christmas. We were all gathered at my parents' estate in Connecticut, the same house where I'd grown up feeling like an outsider in my own family. Caroline had just bought her 3rd rental property, Bradley was bragging about his latest bonus, and Jessica was planning a European vacation that cost more than my annual salary. The conversation turned, as it always did, to money. "Marcus, you really should consider switching careers," my father said, cutting into his prime rib. "This social work thing is admirable, but you're not building anything for your future. Your trust distributions won't last forever." "Speaking of which," Uncle David chimed in, "we should probably discuss the upcoming changes to the trust structure. Some adjustments need to be made for tax purposes." I looked up from my plate. "What kind of adjustments?" The table went quiet. Caroline and Bradley exchanged glances. My mother suddenly became very interested in her wine glass. "Well," my father cleared his throat, "the financial advisors think it would be more efficient to consolidate some of the smaller distributions. Streamline things." "What does that mean exactly?" "Marcus," Aunt Patricia sighed, "this is exactly what we mean about you being too sensitive. You immediately assume something negative is happening." "I'm not assuming anything. I'm asking a direct question." "The restructuring mainly affects the grandchildren's portions," Uncle David explained. "Carolyn and Bradley's distributions will increase since they've shown more financial responsibility. Jessica's trust will be managed by her husband since she's focused on family now. And yours?" He paused. "Well, we think it might be better if your portion was managed more conservatively." The room felt like it was spinning. "Managed by whom?" "By us," my father said simply. "The primary trustees. We'll make sure you have what you need when you need it. I set down my fork carefully. So you're taking away my direct access to my inheritance. We're protecting it, Caroline said. Marcus, you have to understand, you make emotional decisions. Remember when you wanted to donate $15,000 to that program for homeless teens? That's not sustainable financial planning. That was my money. It's family money, Bradley corrected, and families look out for each other. I looked around the table at these people, my blood relatives, the ones who were supposed to love and support me, and saw them clearly for the first time. The condescending smiles, the practiced explanations, the way they'd already decided my fate without including me in the conversation. When were you planning to tell me about this? I asked quietly. We're telling you now, my father said. The paperwork goes into effect January 1st. That's next week, which is why we're discussing it now. I stood up from the table. Every eye was on me, waiting for the emotional outburst they expected. The tears, the shouting, the dramatic exit that would prove once again that Marcus was too sensitive to handle adult responsibilities. Instead, I smiled. Okay, I said calmly, I understand. The relief on their faces was almost comical. They'd expected a fight, and my apparent acceptance made them visibly relax. I'm glad you're being mature about this, my mother said warmly. Of course, I replied. Family first, right? I excused myself early, citing an early morning commitment. As I drove home to my modest apartment, my mind was racing, not with emotion, but with calculation. They thought my sensitivity was a weakness, but it had actually been my greatest strength. I'd been paying attention when they thought I wasn't. I'd been listening when they assumed I couldn't understand. I'd been watching when they believed I was too naive to see. And I'd been keeping records. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and opened my laptop. Over the years, I'd developed a habit of documenting things. Dates, conversations, financial statements. Call it paranoia, call it being too sensitive, but I'd learned early that my family's version of events didn't always match reality. What I found in my files made my blood run cold. The trust distributions hadn't just been unequal, they'd been systematically manipulated for over a decade. While I'd been receiving my modest quarterly payments, Caroline, Bradley, and Jessica had been getting distributions nearly 3 times larger. Money that should have been held in trust for future generations had been quietly funneled into side investments controlled by the trustees. Properties had been purchased with trust funds and titled in my father's name. But the real revelation came when I cross-referenced the dates of major family decisions with the trust's financial statements. Every time I'd been excluded from important conversations, every time I'd been told I was too sensitive to understand complex matters, significant amounts of money had been moved. They hadn't been protecting me from financial complexity. They'd been protecting themselves from my questions. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Instead of heading to the community center where I usually spent my days helping teenagers navigate impossible situations, I drove to the offices of Hammond & Associates, the law firm that had been handling the Whitmore Family Trust since its inception. Margaret Hammond was 72 years old, sharp as a razor, and had known my grandfather personally. She'd been expecting my call. Marcus, she said, settling behind her mahogany desk with a thick manila folder. I wondered when you'd finally come to see me. Finally? She opened the folder and pulled out a handwritten letter, the paper yellowed with age. Your grandfather left this for you specifically. Instructions that it should only be given to you when you turned 25, or if you ever requested a full audit of the trust. You're 28 now. My hands trembled slightly as I took the letter. Grandpa Ted's familiar handwriting filled 2 pages. Marcus, if you're reading this, it means you've figured out that something isn't right. I always knew you would. You were the only one who really listened when I told my stories, the only one who asked questions that mattered. Your father thinks your sensitivity is a flaw, but I recognized it as intelligence. The trust I established contains safeguards that your father doesn't know about. Emergency provisions that allow any beneficiary to freeze all distributions and demand a complete forensic audit if they suspect mismanagement. The trigger phrase is fiduciary accountability review. Use it wisely. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I trusted Richard to do right by the family, but I also trusted you to keep him honest. Don't let anyone convince you that caring too much is wrong. It's the people who don't care enough that you need to worry about. Your grandfather, Theodore Whitmore. Margaret watched me read, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she leaned forward. Your grandfather was a complicated man, she said. He loved his family, but he wasn't naive about human nature. He saw potential problems and built-in solutions. These emergency provisions, are they real? Completely legitimate and legally binding. If you invoke them, all trust distributions stop immediately pending a full investigation. No one can access funds. Not your father, not your cousins, nobody. The entire trust freezes until the audit is complete. I thought about the paperwork my father had mentioned, the changes that were supposed to take effect in 6 days. What if the trustees have already made alterations to the trust structure? Margaret's smile was predatory. Any modifications made without the knowledge or consent of all beneficiaries can be challenged and reversed, especially if those modifications were made in anticipation of an audit. The pieces were falling into place. The rushed timeline, the casual way they'd announced the changes, the assumption that I'd simply accept whatever they decided, it all made sense now. They weren't just managing my inheritance, they were trying to hide it before I could figure out what was really happening. Mrs. Hammond, I said carefully, I'd like to request a fiduciary accountability review. Her pen was already moving across a legal pad. I'll need you to sign several documents and provide a sworn statement detailing your concerns. The process will take approximately 6 months, during which time the trust will be completely frozen. Are you prepared for the consequences? I thought about Caroline's new properties, Bradley's expensive lifestyle, my parents' recent kitchen renovation that had cost more than I made in 2 years. I thought about Jessica's European vacation plans and Uncle David's new boat. I thought about all the times I'd been told I was too emotional, too sensitive, too naive to understand how money really worked. I'm prepared. Quote, within 48 hours, certified letters had been delivered to every member of my family. The trust was officially frozen pending investigation. No distributions, no loans, no access to funds until the forensic audit was complete. My phone started ringing before I even made it home from the law office. Caroline called first, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. Marcus, what the hell have you done? I requested an audit. You can't just freeze the trust. There are bills to pay, investments to maintain. This is incredibly selfish. Selfish? Yes, you're punishing the entire family because you're upset about the restructuring. This is exactly what we mean about you being too emotional. I hung up on her. Bradley called 20 minutes later, his usual arrogance replaced by something that sounded suspiciously like fear. Cousin, we need to talk. This audit thing is going to cost everyone money, legal fees, accounting fees. It's going to eat into the trust principle. Then there shouldn't be anything to hide. It's not about hiding anything, it's about family loyalty. We've always taken care of each other. Have we? The line went quiet for a long moment. Then, what do you want, Marcus? Money? A bigger distribution. We can work something out. I want the truth. The truth is that you're destroying the family over nothing. I hung up on him too. My parents arrived at my apartment, unannounced that evening. I watched through the peephole as they stood in the hallway, my father checking his Rolex, my mother clutching her purse like a shield. For the first time in my life, they looked small. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. Son, my father began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had intimidated me for decades. This has gone far enough. You're embarrassing the family. Am I? Yes, my mother said, her eyes red-rimmed. People are talking. The Hendersons asked me at the country club if we were having financial difficulties. Do you know how humiliating that was? More humiliating than systematically stealing from your own son? My father's face flushed. We never stole anything. Every decision we made was in the family's best interest. Whose family? Marcus, my mother pleaded. You don't understand how these things work. Trust is complicated. There are tax implications, legal requirements. We were protecting you from all of that. By lying to me for 10 years? Quote, "We simplified things so you wouldn't have to worry about them," my father said. "You were never good with money anyway. Remember when you wanted to buy that ridiculous car in college? Or when you donated half your Christmas bonus to that shelter? You mean when I made decisions about my own money that you didn't approve of?" My father stepped closer, and for a moment I saw a flash of the man who'd built his own fortune by acquiring and dismantling smaller companies. "You're playing with forces you don't understand, son. This audit will destroy relationships that have taken decades to build. Business partnerships, family bonds, all of it will be gone." "Maybe it should be." "You don't mean that." I looked at these two people who'd raised me, who'd taught me to be ashamed of my own nature, who'd convinced me that my instincts were wrong and my feelings didn't matter. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't seeking their approval. "The audit will be complete in 6 months," I said calmly. "If everything was handled properly, you have nothing to worry about." "And if we refuse to cooperate?" my father asked. "Then the trust remains frozen indefinitely, and the court will appoint an independent administrator. Either way, the days of managing my inheritance without my knowledge are over." My mother started crying. Not the quiet, dignified tears she'd perfected for public consumption, but ugly, desperate sobs. "Marcus, please. You're destroying everything your grandfather built." "No," I said, stepping back into my apartment. "I'm protecting it." I closed the door and turned the deadbolt. Through the thin walls, I could hear my mother's voice rising in the hallway, my father trying to quiet her, their footsteps finally retreating toward the elevator. That night, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and opened the case files I'd been neglecting at work. These were the stories that had taught me about family dysfunction, about power imbalances, about what happened when people who were supposed to protect you decided instead to exploit you. My phone buzzed with text messages throughout the evening. Aunt Patricia demanded I call her immediately. Uncle David asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss this misunderstanding. Jessica's husband informed me that I was jeopardizing his family's financial security and should, quote, consider the legal ramifications of my actions. But the message that stopped me cold came from Caroline at 11:47 p.m. "You have no idea what you've started. Some secrets are buried for good reasons." I screenshotted the message and forwarded it to Margaret Hammond with a note, "Evidence of potential witness intimidation." Her response came back within minutes, noted and documented. "Sleep well, Marcus. Tomorrow we will start digging." The forensic accountant Margaret Hammond recommended was a woman named Dr. Elena Vasquez, and she looked exactly like someone who'd spent her career following money trails that people desperately wanted to keep hidden. Sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, and the kind of focused intensity that made you want to confess things you hadn't even done. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, spreading documents across the conference table at Hammond & Associates. "In 30 years of forensic accounting, I've rarely seen a case this creative." 3 weeks into the audit, she'd already uncovered enough irregularities to fill a banker's box. But as she walked me through her preliminary findings, I realized the word irregularities was like calling a hurricane inclement weather. "Let's start with the property acquisitions," Dr. Vasquez said, pulling out a thick folder. Between 2019 and 2023, the trust purchased 17 properties across Connecticut and Massachusetts. Commercial buildings, residential rentals, undeveloped land, total value, approximately $14 million. She slid a series of deeds across the table. Every single property was titled in my father's name. Trust funds purchased them, but legally, your father owns them outright. The documentation shows these were classified as, quote, strategic investments for trust growth, but there's no mechanism in place for the trust to actually benefit from any appreciation or rental income. My stomach dropped. Where does that money go? Into personal accounts controlled by the trustees. We're talking about roughly $2 million in annual rental income that never makes it back to the trust. She opened another folder. Then we have the consulting fees. Since 2018, the trust has paid Hammond & Associates for legal services, which is normal. But it's also paid Richard Whitmore Financial Advisory, David Whitmore Investment Services, and Patricia Whitmore Estate Planning. Combined, these entities have received over $3 million in fees. Those are their companies. Quote, Richard Whitmore Financial Advisory is your father's sole proprietorship. David Whitmore Investment Services is your uncle's LLC. Patricia Whitmore Estate Planning doesn't appear to exist anywhere except on trust payment records. The room felt like it was tilting. They've been paying themselves? Extensively. And here's where it gets interesting. Dr. Vasquez pulled out a timeline chart. The consulting payments always spike right before major family events. Your sister's wedding in 2021? Your father's company received a $150,000 estate planning consultation fee 2 weeks prior. Your cousin Bradley's house purchase? David's investment firm got paid $200,000 for portfolio restructuring the month before. I stared at the papers, trying to process the scope of what I was seeing. They've been using the trust as their personal bank account. That's not even the worst part. She opened a final folder, this one marked confidential in red letters. The distributions to beneficiaries have been deliberately miscalculated for over a decade. According to the original trust documents, all grandchildren should receive equal quarterly payments. But look at this. She showed me a spreadsheet that made my vision blur. While I'd been receiving payments averaging $12,000 per quarter, Caroline had been getting $38,000. Bradley's payments averaged $42,000. Jessica's distributions, which supposedly went directly to her husband for management, were $51,000 per quarter. How is that possible? Your payments were classified as educational support rather than inheritance distributions. Educational support is capped at a much lower rate and doesn't increase with trust growth. Meanwhile, your cousin's payments were reclassified as, quote, family business investments and a, quote, estate development funds, which have much higher limits. The mathematical precision of it was staggering. Every loophole exploited, every technicality twisted to their advantage. They hadn't just stolen from me. They'd convinced me I was getting exactly what I deserved while systematically enriching themselves and my cousins. Dr. Vasquez, I said carefully, in your professional opinion, what are we looking at here? She removed her glasses and cleaned them slowly. Embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent misrepresentation, grand larceny. Take your pick. The total amount involved is approximately $18 million over 12 years. $18 million. The number sat in my chest like a stone. What happens now? That depends on what you want to happen. We can pursue civil recovery, criminal charges, or both. But Mr. Whitmore, you need to understand, this will destroy your family. Permanently. Your father and uncle will likely face jail time. Your aunt could lose her professional license. The scandal will follow all of you for the rest of your lives. I thought about Caroline's text message, about the desperation in my mother's voice, about the way my father had tried to intimidate me in my own doorway. I thought about 28 years of being told I was too sensitive, too emotional, too naive to understand how the world really worked. They made their choices, I said. Now I'm making mine. That afternoon, I drove to my old elementary school. It was a Tuesday, so the playground was full of kids at recess, laughing, arguing, playing games, where the rules changed every 5 minutes depending on who was winning. I sat in my car and watched them, thinking about the boy I'd been at their age, sensitive, intuitive, quick to cry when things felt unfair. My phone rang. Caroline. Marcus, we need to talk. Not over the phone. Meet me at Morrison's Deli in an hour. I don't think that's a good idea. Please, as your sister. There are things you don't know, things that will change how you see all of this. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Morrison's Deli was where our family used to go for Sunday lunch when I was little, back when the world felt simpler and I still believed my parents were heroes. Caroline was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with an untouched coffee, and the kind of haunted expression I'd never seen on her face before. Thank you for coming, she said as I slid into the opposite seat. Caroline, if this is an attempt to get me to drop the audit, it's not. She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug like she was trying to warm herself. Marcus, do you remember when Mom and Dad almost got divorced? You were maybe 14. I remembered. 3 months of tense silences, closed-door conversations, Dad sleeping in the guest room. Then suddenly everything went back to normal, and we never talked about it again. Dad was having an affair. Not just an affair. He'd been living a double life for 2 years. Apartment in the city, credit cards Mom didn't know about, the whole thing. She hired a private investigator. Why are you telling me this? Caroline's hands were shaking. Because the money he was spending. It came from the trust. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. Mom found out everything. The affair, the financial irregularities, all of it. She could have divorced him and taken half of everything, including his portion of the trust. But she didn't. No, because Grandpa Ted had died the year before, and Dad convinced her that exposing him would destroy the family legacy. He promised to end the affair, pay back the money, and never touch trust funds inappropriately again. I felt something cold spreading in my chest. But he didn't pay it back. No. Instead, he got creative. Uncle David and Aunt Patricia became complicit because they were terrified the whole trust would collapse if the theft came to light. They helped him cover his tracks by restructuring everything to look legitimate. Caroline finally looked up at me, and I saw tears in her eyes. The consulting fees, the property purchases, even our inflated distributions. It all started as a way to hide Dad's original theft. We became accessories to keep the family together. And my distributions were kept low to free up more money for the cover-up. Marcus, I swear I didn't know the full extent until last week. I thought you were just getting less because you chose a lower-paying career. I thought it was fair. The word hung between us like poison. Fair. How much did he steal originally? $4.7 million. Everything since then has been to hide that number. I sat back in the booth, feeling like I'd been punched. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. Not just the money, but the years of psychological manipulation designed to make me complicit in my own exploitation. Caroline, I said slowly, are you asking me to let this go? I'm asking you to understand that bringing this to light won't just hurt Dad. It'll destroy Mom, who spent 15 years living with the shame of what he did. It'll destroy Uncle David's construction business and Aunt Patricia's law practice. It'll destroy Jessica's marriage when her husband finds out her trust money was never legitimate to begin with. She reached across the table and touched my hand. And it'll destroy me. My law firm will fire me the moment this becomes public. Everything I've built will be gone. Quote, I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw something I'd never noticed before. The same sensitivity I'd been criticized for my entire life, buried under years of corporate armor and careful emotional control. You've known something was wrong for years, haven't you? She nodded, unable to speak. And you've been living with it. The guilt, the shame, the knowledge that your success was built on stolen money. Every day, she whispered. Then you understand exactly how I felt my entire life, except I was told it was my fault for being too sensitive. I stood up from the booth. Caroline looked up at me with desperate hope in her eyes. Marcus? The audit continues, I said. All of it. Every crime, every lie, every dollar. The whole truth. Please. You said some secrets are buried for good reasons. But the only reason this was buried was to protect the people who committed the crimes. I'm done protecting them. I walked away, leaving Caroline crying in the booth where we'd shared countless family meals built on lies I was too young and too trusting to see. The criminal referral was filed on a Thursday morning in March. I knew because Detective Sarah Chen from the Connecticut State Police called me at 7:43 a.m. to schedule an interview. Her voice was professionally neutral, but I could hear the underlying excitement. Financial crimes investigators lived for cases like this. Clear paper trails, multiple suspects, millions of dollars in damages. Mr. Whitmore, I want you to understand that once we begin the criminal investigation, there's no going back. Are you prepared for that? I was sitting in my kitchen, watching the sunrise through my small window. In 6 hours, I would be walking into the police station to give a formal statement that would likely send my father to prison. Detective Chen, I've been preparing for this my entire life. I just didn't know it. The next 72 hours unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of legal machinery. Search warrants were executed simultaneously at 3 locations: my parents' house, Uncle David's office, and the downtown building where Aunt Patricia ran her law practice. Federal agents seized computers, financial records, and boxes of documents that would take months to analyze. I wasn't there to see any of it. Margaret Hammond had advised me to stay away, to let the investigation proceed without any appearance of personal involvement. But the local news covered it extensively. Helicopter footage of federal agents carrying bankers' boxes out of the Whitmore family estate. Interviews with neighbors expressing shock and disbelief. A brief statement from Caroline's law firm announcing her temporary leave of absence pending resolution of personal matters. My phone rang constantly. Reporters, distant relatives, former classmates who'd suddenly remembered my existence. I stopped answering calls from numbers I didn't recognize. But I did answer when my mother called on Friday evening. "Marcus," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "they arrested your father." The words hit me like cold water. I'd known this was coming, had actively set the wheels in motion, but hearing it made everything suddenly, brutally real. "Where are you, Mom?" "At home. The lawyers say I can't leave the state. They think I might be charged too." She started crying then. Not the manipulative tears I'd seen so many times before, but the raw, broken sobs of someone whose world had collapsed completely. "I never wanted any of this," she said. "When I found out about the affair, about the money, I just wanted to keep the family together. I thought if we could fix it quietly, make it right somehow, we could move past it. By lying to me for 15 years? By protecting you from the truth. Marcus, you were so young when this started. So innocent. We thought if we could handle it ourselves, you'd never have to know how ugly things really were." I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar pull of guilt and sympathy that had controlled me for decades. Even now, with overwhelming evidence of their crimes, part of me wanted to comfort her. "Mom, do you understand what you did to me? The psychological damage of being told I was too sensitive, too emotional, too naive to handle reality, when the reality was that you were all lying to me? We were trying to protect you. You were trying to protect yourselves." The line went quiet for a long moment. Then, "Your father wants to see you. He's being held at the county jail until the bail hearing. He says there are things he needs to explain, things that will help you understand." "I understand perfectly." "Marcus, please. Whatever you think of us, we're still your family. We still love you." "Do you? Because love doesn't steal from the people it claims to protect. Love doesn't gaslight and manipulate and lie for years. Love doesn't convince someone that their basic human instincts are character flaws." Quote, "We made mistakes. You committed felonies, multiple felonies, over more than a decade. That's not a mistake, Mom. That's a choice you made every day for 15 years. I hung up and immediately called Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the therapist I'd started seeing 2 weeks earlier. She'd specialized in family trauma and financial abuse, and had been helping me process the psychological impact of everything I'd discovered. "Marcus, how are you feeling right now?" she asked during our emergency phone session. "Guilty, angry, relieved, terrified, sometimes all at once." "That's completely normal. You've essentially had to reconstruct your entire understanding of your family and your place in it. The guilt you're feeling, tell me about that." I walked to my living room window and looked out at the street where I'd grown up riding my bike, believing my parents were good people who wanted the best for me. I keep thinking about my mom crying, about Caroline losing her job, about Jessica's kids finding out their grandfather is a criminal. Part of me wants to call the prosecutor and say this was all a misunderstanding. And what stops you? The knowledge that if I do that, they'll just find new ways to exploit me. The pattern will continue, maybe for the rest of my life. And the next victim might be Jessica's children, or Caroline's future kids, or whoever comes after me. You're breaking a cycle of abuse, Marcus. That's never easy, even when it's necessary. The bail hearing was scheduled for Monday morning. Against Margaret Hammond's advice, I decided to attend. I needed to see my father's face when the charges were read aloud in open court. The Cumberland County Courthouse was an imposing granite building that had always intimidated me as a child. Now, walking up those same steps as an adult, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Power. Not the corrupted, destructive power my family had wielded over me, but the clean, legitimate power of truth and justice. My father's attorney was someone I didn't recognize, a young public defender who looked overwhelmed by the complexity of the case. The prosecutor, by contrast, was a seasoned veteran named James Morrison, who'd built his career prosecuting white-collar crime. When they brought my father into the courtroom, I barely recognized him. The confident, authoritative man who'd dominated every room he entered was gone. In his place was someone who looked smaller, older, defeated. His hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled from a weekend in jail. Our eyes met across the courtroom, and for a moment I saw something that might have been regret. Or maybe just fear. Judge Patricia Wilson read the charges in a clear, measured voice. Embezzlement in the first degree, conspiracy to commit fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, money laundering, and racketeering. Each count carried a potential sentence of 5 to 20 years in prison. The bail amount was set at $2 million, secured by property. My father's attorney requested permission for him to use the family estate as collateral, but the prosecutor objected. Your Honor, the defendant has already demonstrated a pattern of converting family assets for personal use. We believe there's substantial risk that any property used as collateral has been purchased with stolen funds. Judge Wilson agreed, cash bail only. I watched my father's face as reality sank in. The family fortune he'd spent decades accumulating and protecting was frozen, inaccessible, potentially forfeit. He would remain in custody until trial unless someone could raise $2 million in legitimate traceable funds. As the court officers led him away, he looked at me one more time. This time, what I saw in his eyes wasn't regret or fear. It was something much colder, blame. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting. I'd prepared a brief statement with Margaret Hammond's help, something measured and appropriate. But standing there on the courthouse steps, looking into the cameras that would broadcast my words across the state, I felt the weight of 28 years of silence. My name is Marcus Whitmore, I began, and for my entire adult life, I was told that my sensitivity was a weakness, that my emotions were inappropriate, that my questions were naive, that my instincts were wrong. I was taught to doubt myself so thoroughly that I almost missed the systematic theft of my inheritance. The reporters leaned in, sensing a story bigger than simple financial crime. But sensitivity isn't weakness. It's awareness. And when you're truly aware, you see things that others miss. You notice patterns that others ignore. You ask questions that others are afraid to ask. I paused, thinking about all the children I'd worked with over the years. Kids who'd been told their feelings didn't matter, whose instincts had been dismissed, who'd been taught to doubt their own perceptions of reality. If you're someone who feels things deeply, who notices inconsistencies, who asks uncomfortable questions, you're not too sensitive. You're exactly sensitive enough. The world needs people who care enough to speak truth to power, even when that power is their own family. I walked away from the microphones, leaving the reporters with their questions and their cameras. For the first time in my life, I'd said exactly what I meant to say, exactly the way I meant to say it. And I'd smiled while I did it. That evening, alone in my apartment, I opened my laptop and began writing. Not case notes for work, not documentation for lawyers, but something entirely different. A letter to my younger self, to all the sensitive children who would grow up in families that taught them to doubt their own hearts. You are not too much, I typed. You are not too sensitive. You are not broken. You are paying attention in a world that profits from your confusion. Trust yourself. Ask questions. Demand answers. And when they tell you that your feelings don't matter, know that they're wrong. Your sensitivity is your superpower. Use it wisely. The trial began 8 months later, on a crisp October morning that reminded me of the day I'd first walked into Margaret Hammond's office. But everything else had changed. The media attention had transformed what should have been a private family matter into a cautionary tale about wealth, privilege, and the corruption of trust. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal observers, and curious members of the public who'd followed the case through months of pretrial hearings. I sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, directly in my father's line of sight. He'd lost weight during his months in county jail. and his hair had gone completely gray. The confident patriarch who'd intimidated me my entire life had been replaced by someone who looked fragile and defeated. But I'd changed too. The young man who'd once sought his approval was gone. In his place sat someone who'd learned to trust his own instincts, who'd discovered that being sensitive wasn't a character flaw, but a form of intelligence. Prosecutor James Morrison's opening statement was devastating in its simplicity. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about trust. Theodore Whitmore trusted his son Richard to protect a family legacy. The beneficiaries trusted the trustees to manage their inheritance honestly. And for over 15 years, that trust was systematically betrayed for personal gain. He walked the jury through the evidence Dr. Vasquez had uncovered: the fraudulent property purchases, the fictitious consulting fees, the deliberately miscalculated distributions. But what struck me most was how he framed the psychological manipulation. The defendants didn't just steal money, Morrison said, his voice rising. They stole something more precious. They stole their victim's confidence in his own judgment. They convinced Marcus Whitmore that his questions were inappropriate, his concerns were unfounded, and his sensitivity was a weakness. They gaslit him so effectively that he almost didn't pursue the very investigation that exposed their crimes. My father's attorney, an expensive defense lawyer named Christopher Vail, who'd been hired with borrowed money, tried to paint a different picture. This is a case about family dynamics, not criminal intent. Richard Whitmore made mistakes in judgment, yes, but he was trying to preserve family wealth during difficult economic times. His decisions may have been questionable, but they weren't criminal. It was a strategy I'd expected. Minimize the crimes, humanize the defendant, suggest that family financial disputes shouldn't be handled in criminal court. But as the evidence unfolded over the next 3 weeks, the scope of the conspiracy became impossible to downplay. Uncle David took the stand first, having negotiated a plea deal in exchange for his testimony. Watching him describe the elaborate schemes they devised to hide the original theft was surreal. This was the same man who'd taught me to fish, who'd given me career advice, who'd sat at countless family dinners acting like a loving uncle while helping to steal my inheritance. Richard was desperate, David testified, avoiding eye contact with my father. After the affair came to light, he needed to replace the money he'd taken before Margaret Hammond's annual audit. We thought if we could just buy some time, find a way to generate returns, we could pay it back without anyone knowing. And when that didn't work, Morrison asked, we got creative. The consulting fees, the property investments, the modified distributions, it all became about maintaining the cover-up. Each year, we needed more money to hide the hole we'd dug the year before. Mr. Whitmore, in your opinion, was your nephew Marcus ever intended to receive his full inheritance? Quote, David's voice barely rose above a whisper. No, we couldn't afford it. His distributions were kept minimal to maintain the cash flow we needed for the scheme. The most damaging testimony came from Caroline. She'd negotiated her own plea agreement, but seeing her on the witness stand was still heartbreaking. My sister looked hollow, aged beyond her years by months of public scrutiny and professional disgrace. I knew something was wrong, she said, tears streaming down her face. The numbers never made sense. Marcus's distributions were so much smaller than ours, but when I asked about it, Dad always had an explanation. He said Marcus was irresponsible with money, that his portion was being managed conservatively for his own protection. Did you believe that? I wanted to believe it. It was easier than accepting that our family was built on lies. Morrison pressed further. Ms. Whitmore, you received substantially larger distributions than your brother for over a decade. Did you ever question whether that was fair? Caroline's breakdown was complete. I told myself Marcus chose a lower-paying career, so it made sense that his trust income would be managed differently. I convinced myself that we each got what we deserved based on our life choices. But deep down, I knew it was wrong. I just didn't want to lose everything I'd built. When my father finally took the stand in his own defense, I braced myself for what would likely be our final conversation, even though it was happening in a courtroom with 12 strangers deciding his fate. Christopher Vail walked him through a carefully crafted narrative about business pressures, family obligations, and decisions made under stress. But when Morrison cross-examined him, the facade crumbled quickly. Mr. Whitmore, you've testified that you intended to repay the money you initially took from the trust. When exactly did you plan to do that? When our investments generated sufficient returns. But those investments were made with additional stolen funds, weren't they? I wouldn't characterize them that way. How would you characterize taking money from a trust without authorization and using it to purchase properties titled in your own name? My father's jaw tightened. I was the trustee. I had discretionary authority. Discretionary authority to steal from your own son? I never stole from Marcus. Morrison walked to the evidence table and picked up a thick folder. Mr. Whitmore, according to the original trust documents, Marcus should have received approximately $1.2 million in distributions over the past decade. He actually received $347,000. Where did the difference go? Trust is complex. There are tax implications, management fees. The $853,000 difference went to cover your thefts, didn't it? No. Morrison opened the folder and pulled out a bank statement. This is your personal account at First National Bank. On March 15, 2022, you deposited $127,000, the exact amount that should have gone to Marcus that quarter. Do you remember what you told your family that deposit was for? My father was silent. You told them it was a bonus from your consulting work, but it was actually Marcus's inheritance, wasn't it? That money was used for family expenses. Whose family? Because Marcus wasn't living in the $2.3 million house that trust funds helped purchase. Marcus wasn't driving the $85,000 car that trust funds helped buy. Marcus wasn't taking the European vacations that trust funds helped finance. I watched my father's face as the prosecutor systematically dismantled every excuse, every rationalization, every lie he'd built over 15 years. For the first time in my life, I saw him as he truly was. Not a powerful patriarch protecting his family, but a frightened man who'd convinced himself that his crimes were justified because they benefited people he cared about more than his own son. Mr. Whitmore, Morrison said quietly, did you ever consider that your sensitive son might have actually been sensitive enough to notice what you were doing? Marcus was never good with financial details. Or maybe Marcus was too good with them, and you needed to convince him otherwise to protect your scheme. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts, my father's legs buckled. The man who'd spent my childhood lecturing me about strength and toughness had to be helped to his chair by court officers. Judge Wilson scheduled sentencing for the following month, but the prosecutors had already indicated they would seek the maximum penalty, 20 years in federal prison. Outside the courthouse, Margaret Hammond found me sitting on a bench, watching the last reporters pack up their equipment. How are you feeling? She asked. I'm not sure yet. Ask me in a few years. She handed me an envelope. The civil recovery is nearly complete. With asset forfeiture and insurance settlements, we should be able to recover approximately $16.8 million of the stolen funds, plus interest and damages. I looked at the number written on the settlement summary. More money than I'd ever imagined having, representing justice for 15 years of psychological and financial abuse. Mrs. Hammond, I want to establish a foundation. For kids who've been told they're too sensitive, too emotional, too different. I want to fund programs that teach children to trust their instincts instead of doubting them. She smiled. I think your grandfather would approve. 3 months later, I stood in front of a group of social workers, therapists, and child advocates at the inaugural conference of the Theodore Whitmore Foundation for Intuitive Children. The irony wasn't lost on me. Using my family's stolen money to help other sensitive kids trust themselves the way I'd been taught not to. Sensitivity isn't a bug in the human operating system, I told the audience. It's a feature. It's the early warning system that tells us when something is wrong, when someone is lying, when the people who claim to love us are actually exploiting us. In the front row, I spotted a familiar face, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the therapist who'd helped me process the trauma of discovering my family's betrayal. Next to her sat a young girl, maybe 12 years old, who reminded me of myself at that age. Wide eyes, careful attention, the kind of child who noticed everything and felt everything deeply. If you're working with a child who's been told they're too sensitive, I continued, please tell them something no one told me. Their feelings are data. Their instincts are intelligence. Their emotional responses are information about the world around them. The girl in the front row was taking notes on a small pad, writing down words like feelings or data, and trust yourself. Watching her, I felt something I'd never experienced before: pride in my own sensitivity, gratitude for the trait that had ultimately saved me from a lifetime of exploitation. After the presentation, she approached me with a question that stopped me cold. Mr. Whitmore, what if the people telling you you're too sensitive are the people who are supposed to love you most? I knelt down to her level, looking into eyes that held the same careful intelligence I'd seen in mirrors my entire childhood. Then you listen to yourself instead, I said. Because sometimes the people who love us most are the people who have the most to lose if we start paying attention. She nodded gravely and walked away, clutching her notebook full of revolutionary ideas. That her feelings mattered, that her observations were valid, that being sensitive was something to protect rather than cure. 6 months after the trial ended, I received a letter from my father. It was the first communication we'd had since his sentencing. I almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity won out. Marcus, it began, I've had a lot of time to think about what I did to you, to our family, to the trust your grandfather established. I know I can't undo the damage, and I know you'll probably never forgive me. But I need you to know that you were right to do what you did. You were right to trust your instincts, right to ask questions, right to demand answers. Your sensitivity was never a weakness. It was the thing I feared most, because I knew that if you ever stopped doubting yourself, you'd see through everything. I'm sorry it took so long, and I'm sorry it cost us both so much. I hope you find peace in knowing that you stopped a cycle that might have continued for generations. Your grandfather would be proud of the man you've become. I read the letter twice, then put it in the folder with all the other documents from the case. Forgiveness would come eventually, or it wouldn't, but understanding had already arrived. My father hadn't destroyed my sensitivity. He'd tried to, but failed. Instead, he'd taught me something even more valuable, that my emotional intelligence was powerful enough to threaten people who had everything to lose. That night, I sat in my new apartment, larger now, brighter, in a better neighborhood, and opened my laptop. I'd been working on a book about family financial abuse, about the psychological tactics used to gaslight victims, about the importance of trusting your instincts even when everyone around you insists you're wrong. The dedication was already written. To every child who's been told they feel too much, you don't. You feel exactly what you're supposed to feel. Trust that. I began typing the final chapter, the one about what happens after you win, after justice is served, after the people who hurt you face consequences for their actions. It wasn't the ending I'd expected when this all began. There was no reunion, no family healing, no Hollywood reconciliation. But it was something better. The knowledge that I'd finally learned to trust the one person who'd never lied to me. Myself. 2 years after the trial ended, I was invited to speak at Harvard Business School about fiduciary responsibility and family wealth management. Standing in that lecture hall, looking out at future business leaders who would one day control billions in assets, I felt the weight of every lesson I'd learned. How many of you come from wealthy families? I asked the room of MBA students. About a third raised their hands. And how many of you have ever questioned how your family's money is managed? Most of the hands went down. That's the problem, I said. We're taught that questioning family financial decisions is disrespectful, disloyal, or naive. But questioning is the only thing standing between ethical wealth management and systematic exploitation. After my presentation, a young woman approached me. She introduced herself as Jennifer Kim, a second-year student whose family owned a chain of restaurants across California. Mr. Whitmore, she said quietly, I think something similar might be happening in my family. My trust distributions stopped last year, and when I asked why, my father said it was for tax optimization. But my brother's distributions continued. We talked for an hour in a coffee shop near campus. Her story was different from mine. No dramatic theft or hidden affairs, but the pattern was familiar. Vague explanations, emotional manipulation, the suggestion that asking questions demonstrated immaturity or greed. What should I do? She asked. Start documenting everything. Get copies of trust documents, ask specific questions, and record the answers. And most importantly, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. 6 months later, she called to tell me she discovered her father had been using trust funds to prop up failing restaurant locations, effectively stealing from her inheritance to subsidize his business losses. Her questions had led to a full audit that recovered nearly $2 million. "You saved my financial future," she said. "No," I replied. "You saved it. I just reminded you to trust yourself." These conversations had become common since the foundation launched. The Theodore Whitmore Foundation for Intuitive Children had grown beyond anything I'd imagined, funding programs in 12 states that taught emotional intelligence, critical thinking, and financial literacy to young people. But the most important work happened in moments like these: one person learning to trust their instincts, one family forced to confront uncomfortable truths. The Foundation's headquarters occupied the top 2 floors of a restored building in downtown Hartford, Connecticut. The space was designed to feel warm and welcoming rather than institutional. Comfortable seating areas, natural light, artwork created by children in our programs. It was everything the sterile conference rooms of my childhood had not been. My assistant, Maria Santos, was a former social worker who understood the mission viscerally. She'd grown up in a family where financial abuse masqueraded as protection, where her college fund had been quietly raided to cover her father's gambling debts. "Marcus," she said one Wednesday morning, "there's someone here to see you. She says it's personal." Caroline stood in the reception area, looking nervous and uncertain. We hadn't spoken since the trial, though I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd left law entirely and was working as a victim's advocate for women escaping domestic violence. "Hello, Marcus." Carolyn. We sat in my office, 2 years of silence stretching between us. She looked healthier than she had during the trial. The haunted expression was gone, replaced by something that looked like hard-won peace. "I wanted to apologize," she said finally, "not just for the money, but for all of it, for every time I participated in making you doubt yourself, for every family dinner where I stayed silent while they criticized your sensitivity, for treating your questions like character flaws instead of legitimate concerns." "Why now?" "Because I've been working with women who've been gaslit by people they trusted, and I see how much damage it does. I see how hard it is to rebuild confidence in your own judgment. And I realized that's what we did to you for decades." She pulled out a folder from her purse. "I've been in therapy, and my therapist suggested I write you a letter. But then I realized a letter wasn't enough. I wanted to show you something." The folder contained photocopies of financial documents dating back to when we were teenagers. Caroline had been keeping her own records, documenting the inconsistencies she'd noticed but never questioned aloud. "I knew," she said simply, "maybe not the full extent, but I knew something was wrong. Your distributions were always smaller. Dad's explanations never quite made sense. Uncle David and Aunt Patricia would get nervous whenever you asked detailed questions about the trust." "Then why didn't you say anything?" "Because I was benefiting from it. Because I was scared of losing my advantages. Because it was easier to believe you were the problem than to accept that our whole family was built on lies." She wiped tears from her eyes. "But mostly because I was a coward. I saw what happened when you asked uncomfortable questions. You got dismissed, criticized, made to feel like there was something wrong with you. I didn't want that to happen to me." We sat in silence for several minutes. Outside my office window, I could see children playing in a nearby park, their laughter carrying on the afternoon breeze. "Caroline," I said finally, "do you remember when we were kids, and you used to have nightmares?" She nodded. "You'd wake up crying, saying something felt wrong but you couldn't explain what. Mom and Dad would tell you it was just your imagination, that you were being silly. But you weren't, were you?" "No, I could sense the tension in the house, the arguments they thought we couldn't hear, the way Dad would disappear for days without explanation, the fear in Mom's eyes when she thought no one was looking. You were sensitive too. You just learned to suppress it better than I did. I learned to survive by not asking questions. You survived by never stopping asking them." Caroline opened another folder. "I want to donate to the foundation. Not money. I know that would feel complicated coming from me, but I want to volunteer. I want to help kids learn to trust their instincts the way I wish I'd trusted mine." Over the following months, Caroline became one of our most effective advocates. Her legal background helped families navigate complex financial situations, and her personal experience made her credible in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. The first family she helped involved twin sisters whose stepfather had been systematically draining their college funds. The girls, both 16, had noticed discrepancies in their account statements but had been told they were too young to understand investment strategies. Quote, "Trust that feeling in your stomach," Caroline told them during their first meeting. When adults give you vague explanations for financial decisions that affect your future, that's a red flag. You have the right to understand where your money is and how it's being managed. The investigation she helped initiate revealed that the stepfather had stolen over $400,000 intended for the girls' education. More importantly, the girls learned that their questions weren't inappropriate. They were intelligent responses to a genuinely problematic situation. Watching Caroline work with those families, Maria told me one evening as we locked up the office, it's like watching someone heal in real time. The Foundation's annual gala took place on a warm evening in May, exactly 3 years after I'd first walked into Margaret Hammond's office. The event was held at the same country club where my family had celebrated countless milestones built on stolen money. The irony was intentional. Margaret Hammond, now in her 70s but still sharp as ever, served as the evening's keynote speaker. She talked about the importance of teaching children to trust their instincts, especially when those instincts conflict with adult authority. Marcus Whitmore could have accepted his family's explanation, she told the audience of donors, advocates, and survivors. He could have convinced himself that his smaller inheritance was fair, that his questions were inappropriate, that his sensitivity was a character flaw. Instead, he trusted the voice inside him that said something was wrong. That decision didn't just save his own financial future, it prevented generations of future exploitation. After the formal program ended, I found myself in conversation with Dr. Elena Vasquez, the forensic accountant who'd uncovered the full scope of my family's crimes. She'd become a friend and frequent collaborator, helping other families navigate similar situations. "Marcus," she said, "I've been thinking about your grandfather's letter. The part where he said he trusted your father to do right, but also trusted you to keep him honest. What about it?" "I think he knew. Maybe not the specifics, but he sensed that Richard had the potential for this kind of betrayal. That's why he built in those safeguards, why he made sure you'd have access to them." The thought had occurred to me before, but hearing it from Elena made it feel more real. Grandpa Ted hadn't just been protecting the trust from outside threats. He'd been protecting it from family members who might prioritize their own interests over the collective good. "He saw the same sensitivity in you that your father tried to suppress," Elena continued. "But instead of viewing it as a weakness, he recognized it as exactly the trait needed to protect family wealth from family corruption." As the evening wound down, I walked through the country club's gardens, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. 3 years ago, I'd been a young man convinced that his emotional responses were character flaws. Tonight, I was someone who'd learned that those same responses were sophisticated intelligence-gathering systems. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Kim, the Harvard student who'd discovered her father's financial irregularities. "Just wanted you to know, my family had the conversation. Dad agreed to full transparency and independent oversight. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Thank you for teaching me to trust myself." These messages had become common. Young people who'd learned to question financial arrangements that didn't make sense. Adult children who'd demanded access to trust documents. Families who'd chosen transparency over tradition. Each story reminded me that the real victory wasn't the money I'd recovered or the justice my family had faced. It was the cycle I'd broken. The pattern of teaching sensitive children to doubt their own perceptions, to accept vague explanations, to prioritize family harmony over financial integrity. Standing in those gardens, I thought about the 12-year-old boy who'd cried at his grandfather's funeral and been told that Whitmore men don't fall apart in public. That boy had grown up to be a man who understood that falling apart was sometimes exactly what was needed, that breaking down old patterns was the only way to build something better. My sensitivity hadn't been cured or managed or overcome. It had been refined, strengthened, and weaponized against the very forces that had tried to suppress it. Every family I helped, every child who learned to trust their instincts, every financial predator who was exposed. They were all victories for that sensitive boy who'd been told his feelings didn't matter. The foundation would continue growing. More programs, more families helped, more children taught that their emotional intelligence was a superpower rather than a disability. But the real work would always be personal. One conversation at a time, one family at a time, one person learning to trust themselves instead of trusting people who benefited from their doubt. As I drove home that night, I passed the house where I'd grown up, the estate that had been sold to pay legal fees and victim restitution. New owners had moved in, a young family with children whose laughter I could hear from the street. The house that had harbored so many secrets was now filled with the kind of openness and honesty I'd always craved. My father was still in federal prison, with 8 years remaining on his sentence. We exchanged letters occasionally, stilted, formal communications that would never heal the fundamental breach between us. But they represented something important. Acknowledgement that the damage had been real, that the consequences had been earned, that some betrayals couldn't be undone with apologies. Uncle David had served 18 months and now worked as a construction foreman, his business empire reduced to a toolbox and a pickup truck. Aunt Patricia had lost her law license and worked as a paralegal, helping other attorneys navigate the kinds of cases she'd once handled herself. Their downfall brought me no satisfaction, but it served as a reminder that actions have consequences, that financial crimes destroy more than bank accounts. They destroy families, relationships, and trust itself. Caroline had found her own form of redemption in her advocacy work, but Jessica had chosen a different path. She'd moved across the country with her family, changing her name and starting over in a place where the Whitmore scandal had never made headlines. I respected her choice, even as I missed the relationship we'd never really had. At my apartment, I opened my laptop and began writing the weekly newsletter that went out to foundation supporters and families we'd helped. This week's topic was about the difference between family loyalty and family exploitation, how to tell when keeping secrets was protecting loved ones versus enabling their destructive behavior. True family loyalty, I wrote, means caring enough about each other to insist on honesty, even when honesty is uncomfortable. It means protecting the most vulnerable family members, not sacrificing them to maintain everyone else's comfort. It means building relationships based on trust, rather than manipulation. If your family asks you to ignore your instincts, doubt your perceptions, or accept explanations that don't make sense, they're not asking for loyalty. They're asking for complicity. The most loving thing you can do for a family built on lies is to insist on truth. I hit send and closed the laptop. Tomorrow would bring new families, new questions, new opportunities to help people trust themselves. But tonight, for the first time in my adult life, I was exactly where I belonged, in a space I'd created, doing work that mattered, surrounded by people who valued sensitivity as strength rather than weakness. They'd called me too sensitive for 28 years. They'd been wrong about everything else. Why should they have been right about that? Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.